Hello and welcome to NRL Fantasy for first time and new players by the NRL Fantasy Amateurs. My name is Mark. I am one of the creators here from the NRL Fantasy Amateurs, and I'm going to talk you through how to play NRL Fantasy as a beginner or a newer player to the game. So the very simple objective for NRL Fantasy is to score as many points as possible. So in NRL Fantasy, there are two formats, overall and head-to-head. Most commonly, people play for overall points, although a lot of us do play against our friends in head-to-head matchups. And depending on whether you are an overall player or a head-to-head player, there are some differences. But as a starting point, we're just going to go with the simple objective of scoring as many points as possible. The key numbers here. So when you build a team, you start with 21 players. So that'll be the same as a NRL Weekly 21. They have 17 match day players, an 18th man, and then a few backups in their 21-man squad. They have a $10 million salary cap, which is the same salary cap that we have in NRL Fantasy, which averages out to be about $476,000 per player across those 21 players. Throughout the course of the year, you get to make 44 trades across 26 different opportunities to trade, which is obviously between round 1 and round 2, round 2 and round 3, so on and so forth. You obviously can have unlimited trades up until the point where it kicks off, and you're not going to trade after the season's already finished. So 26 opportunities in 27 NRL rounds, which averages out to 1.7 trades per week on average. The maximum amount of trades you can do is 2 early in the season. And then in the middle of the season, I think it's around 9, it increases up to 3 trades. And then once we hit the State of Origin period, you can trade up to 4 trades per week. But you can only do a maximum of 44 in the year, and you only get an average of 1.7. So you're going to see where we're going with this, which is you can't spend the maximum amount of trades every single week, or you're going to run out really, really quickly. So a lot of people do that. It's a mistake they make when they're brand new, which is why we see a lot of people spending a lot of trades early. So the NRL holds 8 trades back for you until after State of Origin, and then you get the remaining 8 after that. So you get 36 to start, and then another 8, which takes it to 44. So you don't waste all your trades early in the year. So the positions is very similar to an NRL 21. You get 1 hooker, 3 middle forwards, 2 edge forwards, 2 halves, 2 centers, and 3 backline players, which is wing and fullback. They combine the wingers and the fullbacks in NRL Fantasy. You get 4 players on your bench, which is this section in purple, and then the red players are your emergency backup players. Scoring, it is based on the players' real in-game scoring statistics. They assign a value to each action. So you see there, for example, a try is worth 8 points, a goal is worth 2 points, a field goal is worth 5 points, and so on. They try to make the value of those scoring actions accurately reflect the value of that action happening to a real-life NRL team. So obviously the biggest value thing you can do is a try. It's also the high-scoring fantasy action. So players' price. So every player starts the season at a certain price, and that price is dictated by their performance in the season prior. So, for example, if they scored an average of 40 points, you can see there on the screen, Chance Nickel Clockstar, average of 40 points, 0.1. So his break even or his starting price approximately is related to that 40-point average. So there are a few exceptions to that. So the exceptions are rookies. Obviously, they've never played before, so we don't know what they average because they didn't average anything, so they have to start at the starting price. There's also international players. So John Bateman, for example, when he came in a few years ago, he didn't start at a rookie price, as everybody would have got him, so they made him more expensive. And also players with small sample sizes. So let's say in 2024, Tino did his ACL after 1.5 games. They typically don't use that average. They typically apply different formulas to those prices to sort of make them make more sense depending on the circumstance. So it's not always exactly right, but that's typically what they do it. Now, through the season, the player's price is going to rise and fall like the stock market based on their 5-game average. So this is what we call the player's break even. So in this example with Chance on the screen here, he's at 551k. He's got a break even of 40. So if he makes 41 or higher, theoretically his price should go up. If he makes 40, it should stay where it is, and if he makes 39 or less, it should go down, and the amount it goes down is related to, or up, is related to how close they go to that break even. Now, obviously, a higher price player, more expensive, is going to need to average more points to sustain that price, and on the opposite side of that, a cheaper, lower scoring average player has to score less points to maintain their price. There is a formula that they use to calculate this break even. It's fairly complicated. It's based on the rolling 5-game average for the player. We strongly suggest following the break evens on one of the sites that does it for free, or simply just paying the $20 to NRL Fantasy Coach to get those break evens accessible to you on a weekly basis. So how do you go about selecting a player to put in your fantasy team? Obviously, there is a set of criteria or a guideline that we use for selecting players. And then on the opposite side of that, there is also a lot of mistakes that new players make. So you maybe have played NRL Fantasy in the past and gotten beaten pretty heavily by people that knew what they're doing. That's them applying the criteria and you probably making these common mistakes. So keep an eye out and see if any of these mistakes is things that you have done in the past. So here's a bad example of players to be picking. What makes a bad option of a player? So only buying from name recognition, that's a big one. So a lot of brand new players, they'll go through, let's say you're a Panthers fan, you might go through and buy Mitch Kenny and Moses Leota and, players that play for the Panthers that and they look like they're cheap compared to their value to the Panthers or your perception of how they are as an NRL player. It doesn't always make the case that NRL fantasy production lines up with NRL, like how they look on the field, but it will match up to their statistics. So just keep in mind that just because you recognize a player's name doesn't mean that they're a good buy or a bad buy. You probably should more likely ignore the player's name or whether they're from a team that you like or don't like. That's the best way to go about it. Also, if there's been no change in their role or their performance. So, for example, you might get a player, let's call it, Daly Cherry Evans. He is a gun player. He's always been a gun player. He does a very similar thing every single year. He is obviously getting older, but there's no real change in his performance or role. Therefore, you wouldn't be looking to select a player like that. He also very rarely gets injured. Even worse than that would be a reduction in a role, so making a player worse. So, for example, in 2025, it looks like Zach Lomax will probably take the goal kicking from Mitch Moses, who otherwise is unaffected, holistically in fantasy. So Mitch Moses is the same player, but without the goal kicking. So theoretically, that means his scoring should go down. You definitely don't want to be buying somebody who's lost some of their role. Another factor for what making a player a bad option could be their team becoming worse. Typically, you find, for example, wingers or fullbacks in bad teams don't score as many tries. That seems like common sense. And also players that are in an inconsistent or an uncertain role. Maybe they're not firmly part of the team's top 17 plans on a weekly basis. Maybe they play big minutes some weeks and low minutes other weeks. Some coaches are very predictable and some coaches are very unpredictable. You probably know which coaches are a bit of a wild card in the NRL. Ricky Stewart is a big example of that. He is a wild card. His rotations change every single week. So he decided last year in 2024 that he was going to put Corey Horsburgh, who played State of Origin, in reserve grade because he didn't like him or for some other reason that had nothing to do with footy. So, those players with inconsistent, uncertain roles or volatile coaches are ones to avoid as well. So some additional notes on top of that. We're trying to avoid state of origin players. Obviously, they miss additional games. They get rested by their team. That one's pretty straightforward. We're trying to avoid players with a record of injury and suspension. Once again, that seems pretty obvious. If a player is constantly getting injured, or someone like a Victor Radley who's always getting suspended, you probably want to avoid them. Also, forwards who are the first player to become backline cover. So typically speaking, a player like Ben Trebojevic is a really good example of this. So anytime Manly have a injury to their center or winger or fullback or halves, Ben Trebojevic moves to center. And that drastically decreases his fantasy scoring. He makes a lot less tackles. So we want to try to avoid those players. We want to avoid players who rely heavily on one particular statistic. So for example, you might have Will Kennedy, who relies really heavily on scoring tries for his fantasy production, or a player might rely really heavily on tackling and doesn't do much else. We really want to try to look for players who have a versatile array of ways that they can score points. We obviously already covered the unpredictable coaches, and the other one is older players. So obviously as a player gets older, they start carrying more injuries. I don't know if you're listening to this, if you're in your teens or early 20s, you probably don't appreciate what it's like to age. As somebody who's in their mid 30s at this time of recording, I can tell you my body is not what it used to be in my early 20s. So as players get older, they're carrying injuries. Maybe they're carrying surgically repaired, shoulders or knees or whatever. So the younger the player is, the less likely they are going to be carrying injuries, and therefore the more likely they are going to be available in your fantasy team. So what's a good example of players to buy? We've just spent a bunch of time talking about negative things that a player might have. So what are some good things? So what makes a good option? An increase in role of performance. So just like we're avoiding players with a decreased role of performance, we're increasing role of performance. That is the type of players that we want to be buying. So for example, now this is going into the history books a little bit. Jared Wallace used to be a bench player for the Broncos. He moved to the Titans, was going to be a starting prop. Or more recently, Tino, same thing, bench player at the Storm, moved over to the Titans. Big explosion in fantasy scoring. They go from being a role-playing bench forward to a starting key forward for their team. That's the type of player that you want to be looking for. Maybe they're picking up the goal kicking. Somebody leaves the team, or maybe, let's say, Lachlan Ilias in 2025, he's moving from the Rabbitohs, where they've got Latrell and had Damien Cook and Cody Walker and all these guys hogging the ball, to the Dragons, where they want him to be, a key man in the spine. That's an increase in role. That's what we're looking for. It's an increase in minutes. Maybe a player, like you look at Jacob Preston in 2023. He started on the bench, then he moved to a starting edge back rower. Massive explosion in fantasy scoring. That's what we're looking for. More minutes, more time on the field to score fantasy points. They might be returning from injury. If you've got a guy, let's say Payne Haas in 2024, he had a number of knee injuries and I think a syndesmosis as well, which caused him to play a few less minutes in a few games. This year, obviously, his price is depressed compared to where it would normally be due to those injuries. That's what we're looking for. Also, maybe you have a player who had a bad year. Their team had, a bad year, or they had lots of small injuries. They didn't score as many tries as expected. We can have a look at that. And then also another one that you can potentially look at, less so than the other ones, is maybe they had an interrupted preseason in the year prior. Maybe they played for their country and only come back in late January, or they were coming off an injury that they didn't quite rehab properly. And this year they've had a full preseason, they're fit, they're healthy. That's worth a couple of points potentially. So keep an eye on that. But you're really looking for the top 2 or 3, increase in role of performance, an increase in minutes, and a return from injury. That's the big 3. So the golden value rule, what we're looking for with a player with regards to their price, is $100,000 in increase in value from a cash cow or a mid-ranger. And we're looking for $50,000 in value from a keeper level scorer. So what do we mean by that? So a cash cow is a player who is $400,000 or less. So because they're a lower price, they've got the maximum potential to increase in price. So what we call them cash cow. And it's really critical to get as many cash cows as possible into your team so that you can make as much money as possible and then sell those players for other cheap players and use those players that you've sold to buy better players. So let's say, for example, you buy a player at 300,000, you sell them at 500,000 to another player that's worth 300,000. You got that $200,000 in your bank now. You could use that to turn one of your players who's 500,000 into a $700,000 gun player. So we'll come to that. The mid-ranger, so that's a player between 400,000 and 600,000. We've got to try to avoid having too many of these guys in your team. But if you are going to need to get some, and you want to be looking for those high upside options. So in this mid-ranger tier, we don't want to be looking for safety. We want to be looking for upside. And what we mean by that, we'll come back to that. And then the value keeper. So that's a player who's over 600,000, typically 600 to 700. They have a smaller amount of value, but they do still have some value, and they're scoring at a keeper level rate, which means they can stay in your team long term. So what makes a player a keeper? Obviously, we've said keeper a couple of times now, but what exactly does that even mean? Okay, so it's based on what they need to average and the number of players who are at that position who average that. So obviously, if every single player at that position averages 30, then there's no real advantage of having that player. So that's not a keeper. So at the hooker position, they need to be averaging at least 50 points to be a keeper. So a player like, Damien Cook, Harry Grant, Reece Robson, for example, they typically average in like 55, or thereabouts. Sometimes you can get hookers who average in the 60s, which is really, really strong, but at least 50 is what you want to be getting from that player. That's the same for the edge back rowers. There are some gun players in that category as well. Players like David Fafita, Angus Crichton, they average in the high 50s and low 60s, but you don't have to get that. A player like a Britton Nikora or Hamole Olakawatu will average 50 plus in the lower 50s, and you can jump on a player like that as a keeper. That's not a problem. Winger fullbacks. We've got a number of really good fullbacks in the NRL. Some of those guys average in the high 50s, low 60s. Your Latrell Mitchell, Kalen Ponga, James Tedesco. We could probably make this 55, but sometimes you get a player like a Scott Drinkwater or something that's right on fringe. Because they are backline players, they typically score less consistently, and they rely more on attacking plays than a forward who just makes lots of tackles and lots of run meters. So we drop that threshold a little bit. The center is the worst scoring position. So the center, anything 45 plus is really good. In an ideal scenario, you can get 50 to 55 average players. There's a few guys that have done that in the past, but 45 is a pretty high bar for a center. So that's kind of where we're at. And there's usually only sort of 5 or 6 guys that can hit that threshold. So you really want 2 or 3 of them in your team. But the top 2 positions is the middle forwards and the halves. So obviously for a half, typically they've got a lot of different ways they can score points. So in the past, we've had halves that have averaged 75. So like Nathan Cleary, Nico Hines, goal kicking, lots of kick meters, lots of running the footy. They can fill up the stat sheet in a lot of different ways. That's the type of player that you want in your halves. Ideally, lots of goal kicking, lots of in-play kicking. They play for a good team, lots of attacking stats. And they're not, a James Maloney that jumps off tackles all the time either. You want them to be pretty solid defensively. So there's a number of players that fit that category, 55 plus for the halves. And then the middle forwards, there's so many really good middle forwards in the NRL. Your Payne Haas, Isaiah Yeo, these type of guys, they average mountains of fantasy points. Ideally, you want that 55 plus. 60, low 60s is a really, like low to mid 60s is a really good middle forward. You can probably squeeze that down to like 52 for a middle, as long as they've got a little bit of upside, but 55 plus should be what you're aiming at for those players. So how to structure your team. Obviously, we spoke about the team earlier. You get 21 players. You need 5 to 6 of those potential keepers, and you need at least 10 cash cows. So that means you've only got maybe 5 mid-rangers in your team, but ideally, if you can get just cash cows and potential keepers, do that and just ignore the mid-ranges unless there's a really good one. So that's sort of what we're aiming at. So how do we build our squad? Well, pretty simple. We've got our team here. As you can see, empty screen, 21 vacant squares. We're going to go over to the top right-hand corner. We've highlighted in yellow there. Sort by price. And you're going to make it the most expensive player at the top. You go through and you're going to select yourself an elite gun captain. So the captain, very important. Double points every week for your captain. So you want to make sure it's an absolutely top shelf elite level player. From there, you're going to pick 4 to 5 more elite gun players. Remember, we're doing 5 to 6 guns total. You've already got your 1 gun captain, so you need 4 to 5 other value keepers. Then you're going to go all the way down to the cheapest players and find as many cash cows as possible. That is guys who are cheap and are going to make money. Don't just buy them because they're cheap. They've got to be guys who are going to make money. Once you finish that, you fill the balance of your team with mid-ranges. Ideally, you have very limited numbers of mid-ranges and your team is mostly value price keepers, your 1 elite gun captain, and cash cows. So, some other handy hints, some other things that we need to remember when we're doing our NRL fantasy team. Okay, pretty simple first one here. Make sure all of the 21 players that you have selected are consistently in their team's top 17. So you don't want to be picking, someone like Jaden Burrell or Viliami Fafita, who was in a lot of teams last year and they didn't play NRL. You can't do that. You've got to pick players who are consistently in the team's match day 17. You can also go into that sort by section and sort by player ownership percentage. So there's some players that are going to be owned by 50, 60, 40% of teams. It's usually a good reason why those players are so highly owned. So if you don't have those players, it's okay that you don't have them. You just need to understand why you're not buying them. So let's say 30% of the teams are people, their managers are idiots, and they've bought a player who's not going to be in their team's top 17, or they've bought a player who's 34 years old or whatever. It's okay that you don't have that player. You just need to know why you don't have them. You got to target players who do not have a bye before the State of Origin period. So obviously, if they don't have a bye early in the season, they're going to play more games for you. The best availability for a player is availability. You don't have to pick players who don't have a bye only. You can select players with bye. It's not a problem. But if you're choosing between 2 players, you can use that as a tiebreaker if you want. And also, another thing that you can use as a tiebreaker, not as a reason why you would pick a player or not, just as an option, is their schedule. So attacking players, they benefit from an easy draw. They're going to score more tries. If they're playing bottom 4 teams every week, they've got more likely they're going to score some attacking stats. On the opposite side of the coin, defensive players make more tackles on a tougher draw. On a tougher draw where the games are lower scoring, there's more time to accrue run meters and tackles. So, there's a benefit to both sets of draws, and you don't have to only pick players with a soft draw. It's just using it as a tiebreaker. So there's some terms here that we might have used that you might not have understood. So going back to some terms, let's see if we can clear some of those up. There's a whole set of slang that's used by the fantasy community. You can come across a term, you might not understand what it means. Post it up in the group if you need to, or send us a message. We can help you out with that one. So there's pod or a point of difference. So that is a player whose ownership is under 10%. So what we're looking for, obviously having a player that not many people own, that's good, is a good option. But if you own a player and you're the only one owning them and they suck, that's bad. So point of difference, not always a good thing, can be a good thing. The BE or the break even. So that's the score at which the player's price remains even. Remember, we discussed that earlier. So if the player scores above their BE, their price goes up. If they score below it, the price goes down. A trap. A player who's a trap may present some value the first time you look at them, but they don't meet the criteria for selection. This might include a player who overperformed in a small number of games. So you might look at a player, they played 1 or 2 games for the Panthers at halfback last year, and they scored a lot of fantasy points. Now they've signed for the Tigers or the Dragons or whoever. It doesn't mean they're going to score that way every single week. It might have just been a flash in the pan. So just be wary of that. So PPM, or points per minute, is the best way of scoring or tracking the scoring of players. It's the average amount of points they score per minute they're on the field. So we use that more for forwards who don't play 80 minutes. So, let's say Payne Haas, he scores 1.1 or 1.05 points for every minute he's on the field, where someone like Josh Alloyer might be 0.7. So that means, there's Payne Haas scores at almost double or 1.5 times the rate of another middle forward. So just be aware, obviously a player with a high PPM or points per minute, they need less minutes to score the same amount of points. So a loophole, you'll hear this a lot. It's a tactic of exploiting the emergency system by intentionally putting a player that you know is not going to play into your scoring 17 to allow you to have 2 bites of the cherry on your emergency scoring. So essentially, what the loophole is if you have a player in your scoring 17 that doesn't play, your 4-man emergency bench, so remember we said there's a 21-man squad, so 18, 19, 20, and 21, they will become part of your scoring 17 if you have players in your scoring 17 that don't play. So what you can actually do is set your team up in a way, exploiting the rules, that you can actually see which one of your emergency players you want to take the score of. It is definitely a grey area in terms of whether it's cheating or not. It's allowed within the rules, so I'd say it's not cheating. It is a bit complicated. So once we start talking through the season about loopholes, if you jump in our Facebook group or our Discord, somebody will be able to help you with loopholing, because it is probably too complicated for me to explain right now. So DPP, or dual position player. It's a player that is eligible to be selected in multiple positions. So remember we said earlier we've got 1 hooker, 3 middle forwards, 2 edge forwards, 2 halves, 2 centers, and 3 winger fullbacks. Sometimes a player might be available to be selected on the middle or on the edge, or at center or fullback, or center and edge. They're the 3 most common ones. Might be a half hooker. So someone like Ben Hunt, who plays half in Clubland and plays hooker. For Queensland, he might be a dual position. He's actually not. He's only half, but he could be. Or maybe someone like, struggling off the top of my head, Isaiah Yeo used to play on the edge. He now plays in the middle. He's actually used to be a dual, and he's now just middle because he only plays middle forward now, but a player like that. So when we talk about the upside or ceiling and the downside of the floor, so the upside or ceiling is the theoretical best case scenario for a player on a weekly basis or over a period of time. So let's say we have 2 players, we think they're both going to average 40. The way in which that player averages that 40 might be completely different. So one player might get 38, then 42, then 39, then 43, then 35, then whatever. Whereas another might get 60, and then 20, and then 63, and then 17, So that would be the upside or ceiling versus the downside or floor. And on the other side of that, there's the downside or floor. So that might be a player, like they might have a high ceiling but a low floor. Maybe it's an outside back who relies on tries to score fantasy points. So it's not good or bad sometimes. Obviously, ideally, you want a player with a high floor and a low ceiling. Oh, no, the other way around. High floor and a high ceiling rather than a low floor. So ideally, you would take a player with a high floor and a high ceiling. That's what you're looking for, and they do exist. But obviously it makes it, it's more difficult to find than, usually players are either consistent or inconsistent rather than having a high floor and high ceiling. Someone might say to you, delete app when you post your team. Pretty simply, that's just somebody taunting you for building a team full of players that they don't think meet the selection criteria. So TLT, or Team List Tuesday, every Tuesday, 4 o'clock, that's New South Wales time, that the team lists come out for every team. So we recommend to players that they don't bother trying to do trades until at least those team lists come out. It eliminates the risk of making a trade for a player that is not playing this week. Maybe they're injured or suspended or something like that, or their role is changing. So we always recommend waiting until those team lists become available. So a rage trade is when a player scores poorly on any given week, or maybe for 2 or 3 weeks in a row, and a new and maybe even an experienced player might feel the urge to impulsively trade them out without considering whether or not it might just be a low scoring patch, and this player's then gonna go up in points again. So, for example, there was a few years ago, Nathan Cleary, who's consistently been the best or one of the best scorers over the last 5 years. He started the season pretty slow. A bunch of people traded him out, and then he exploded. You definitely don't want to be rage trading where possible. Tunning up. This is not a big one for us, but there's some other podcasts that use this. Basically means a player scoring 100 points in a week. It does happen, but it is rare. More often than not, 0 players for the entire week will score 100, or maybe 1. It's very rare for more than 1 a week to do it. So yeah, don't. Usually when people say, oh, such and such is going to ton up, they're joking or thinking that they're going to get a big score, not necessarily 100. And then obviously the last one there, value. When we speak about value, we speak about the gap between the player's likelihood, or like what their moving forward average is going to be, and what their price is at the moment. So for example, that player there is 475k. Divide that by 13,800, which is usually approximately what the magic number is, the number of how they dictate the break even. It's a 34.4 average is where they're priced at, which means we want them to increase by at least 100 grand, which is about 8 times 13,800. So you need them to be at least 43 points per game from now onwards. A lot of people make the mistake of looking at the player's average for the season and using that as a value. Just because they've averaged that this season, it doesn't mean they're going to keep averaging that. So it only counts what they average from when you buy them to when you sell them, not what they've averaged before you had them, because you don't get those points. So don't bother looking at that, except for trying to work out what you think they're going to score in the future, but don't count it into the average that you're calculating the value from. So some closing tips, finishing the video. Number 1, visit our website, www.amateursfantasysports.com/NRL, and view each team's page for our predicted round 1 teams and each player's projected scoring range. So what we'll have in there is what we think their round 1 team's going to be as we get information. It's consistently being updated through the preseason, and we'll give you a scoring range, might be 40 to 44 average, or 37 to 41, or whatever it is. So we typically do 5 points, so that would be 40, 41, 42, 43, 44. That's 5. So we would typically do that. So go and check that out, and you can, if you're not really sure about what players hold value, you can have a look, see what their price is, see what their projection is, and we highlight the players that we think are worth having a look at for fantasy coaches. You can also join our free Facebook group and Discord channel. There's over 5,000 people in the Facebook group. The Discord channel, there's lots of stuff happening over there. There's people constantly talking fantasy. There's no dumb questions. There's always people available to help out new players. So jump in both of those areas. And also consider becoming a good friend of the show. So we have a subscriber program called Good Friends of the Show. It's run through Buy Me a Coffee. We do exclusive member content with individual player-by-player in-depth articles and analysis. We have a private members Discord channel. We have game theory, which is like a tactical analysis of NRL fantasy, and a lot more. That's all available to our subscribers, and that's $5 a month. So that's pretty much nothing, and that's just buymeacoffee.com/fantasyamateurs/membership, and you can check that out. Lastly, if there's one thing you remember from this entire video, make this it. Don't waste your trades. Don't rage trade and trade one guy who sucks to another guy who sucks. Make sure when you're trading, you're doing it deliberately. You're selling a player who's reached their maximum value to a player who has lots of money to make or is an elite scorer. That's it. That's how to win NRL fantasy and how to beat your mates. That is how to do it. Buy players for cheap, have them increase in price, and then sell them to better players who are going to increase in price once they've maxed out their value, and fill your team full of elite gun players. That is the way to win 100% of the time. Hopefully this is a helpful video for you. If you've got any questions, comments, concerns, drop them in the comments. And we would love to see you in the Facebook group, the Discord. Till next time, love you.